Big Shaq was enjoying a quiet dinner when a rich woman's voice cut through the restaurant. People like you don't belong here. Forks stopped midair. Conversations died. Every eye turned. But instead of reacting with anger, Shaq simply grinned. What happened next humiliated her, shook the entire city, and made headlines worldwide. Stay till the end, because this story will leave you speechless. Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. Big Shaq settled into the plush leather seat of the upscale restaurant, a satisfied smile tugging at the corners of his lips. The warm glow of the chandeliers above cast a soft golden hue over the elegant dining room, where crystal glasses clinked and hushed conversations carried across tables draped in pristine white linen. Tonight was supposed to be a simple evening of celebration. Good food, good company, and a well-deserved break after his latest charity event. A young waiter approached, his neatly pressed uniform crisp against his lean frame. Daniel, as his name tag read, radiated professionalism, but carried an unmistakable glimmer of admiration in his eyes. "It's an honor to serve you, sir," he said, his voice steady but tinged with excitement. Shaq grinned, nodding in appreciation. "Thanks, young man. Just doing your job. Keep up the good work." As Daniel poured Shaq's water and turned to tend to another table, a sharp, venom-laced voice shattered the peaceful hum of the restaurant. "They let those kinds of people in here now?" The words, dripping with disdain, sliced through the air, turning heads in quiet disbelief. At a nearby table, an older woman with an air of self-importance and an expensive fur shawl draped over her shoulders sat with a glass of wine in one hand. Karen Whitmore, socialite, real estate heiress, and a woman used to getting exactly what she wanted. She sneered in Shaq's direction, but locked her sights on Daniel, eyes narrowing with pure entitlement. Daniel, ever the professional, ignored the comment and continued his work. But the moment he walked past Karen's table, it happened. A loud, skin-stinging smack rang through the restaurant. Daniel jerked backward, eyes wide in shock, a red mark blooming across his cheek. Gasps rippled through the dining room. Conversations halted mid-sentence. The clinking of silverware against porcelain ceased altogether. Every pair of eyes locked onto the scene. Disbelief thick in the air. Karen scoffed, shaking out her manicured hand as if she had just touched something filthy. "How dare you serve him before me?" she hissed, her voice filled with entitled rage. Daniel swallowed hard, his hands trembling, but he didn't retaliate. He didn't even defend himself. Years of working in customer service had taught him one thing: when people like Karen caused a scene, fighting back only made things worse. But this time was different. Because across the room, Shaq slowly put down his fork. A deep, heavy silence followed as he dabbed the corners of his mouth with his napkin, his movements calculated, deliberate. Then he leaned back in his chair, his towering frame making the luxurious seat seem small. His eyes, calm yet dangerous, locked onto Karen's with an intensity that made the once arrogant woman shift uncomfortably. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady but laced with an unmistakable warning. "You just messed up big time." The restaurant held its breath. Karen's smirk wavered, but she quickly masked it with arrogance. What could he possibly do? A tense silence hung over the restaurant, thick enough to be cut with a knife. All eyes were on Karen, who sat with a smug grin, entirely unfazed by the growing unease in the room. The sting of her slap still burned on Daniel's cheek, but the waiter refused to react. He clenched his jaw, keeping his composure, though his hands trembled ever so slightly. Shaq, on the other hand, was not as patient. With a slow, deliberate motion, he pushed back his chair, the wood scraping against the polished marble floor. As he stood, the room seemed to shrink under his towering presence. His massive frame cast a shadow over Karen's table, and for the first time, a flicker of hesitation crossed her face. She instinctively leaned back, gripping the stem of her wineglass a little tighter. But the moment was brief. Karen quickly shook off whatever instinctual fear had crept up her spine and rolled her eyes. "Oh, please," she scoffed, waving her hand dismissively. "What's the problem? It's just a waiter." A murmur of disbelief spread through the crowd. Whispers rippled across the restaurant, the quiet gasps of shocked patrons growing louder. Phones were out now. Screens glowed as customers recorded everything, capturing Karen's every word, her every smug expression. Daniel swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. "Ma'am, I was just doing my job." Karen let out a sharp, cruel laugh. Your job is to know your place, she snapped. Then turning to Shaq, she smirked, eyes flicking up and down his broad figure. And what? You think standing up for him is going to do anything? This is my town. I can do whatever I want. A hush fell over the room as the restaurant manager suddenly emerged from the back, his expression tight with concern. Ma'am, please calm down, he said, stepping closer. Karen's lips curled in amusement. Or what? She challenged, eyes gleaming. You'll throw me out? Go ahead, try it. You'll be out of business by morning. The arrogance in her voice was enough to make people shift uncomfortably in their seats. Shaq, however, simply smirked. His eyes, dark and unreadable, held an eerie calm. We'll see about that. Karen's confidence faltered for a split second. Just a second. But it was enough for the people around her to sense something had shifted. Something was coming, and it wasn't going to be good for her. Karen leaned back in her chair, swirling her wine with an air of amusement, oblivious to the weight of the moment. The tension in the restaurant was thick, the only sound now the faint clinking of silverware as a few diners hesitantly resumed their meals, all while keeping their eyes locked on the unfolding drama. Shaq, still towering over her, let out a low chuckle, a sound that sent a ripple of unease through the room. Karen arched a brow. Oh, what's this? She scoffed, tilting her head dramatically. You gonna call the police? What, you think they'll come running just because you say so? Shaq's smirk widened, his fingers already moving across his phone screen. Nah, he said, pressing the dial button. I got someone better. Karen's smile wavered for the briefest second. A flicker of uncertainty passed through her features, but she masked it quickly, scoffing as she leaned forward on her elbows. Oh, this is rich, she laughed, shaking her head. What, you think you're some kind of VIP? Shaq didn't answer. Instead, he placed his phone on speaker and let the call ring. The restaurant fell completely silent. One ring, two. Then a deep, authoritative voice answered. Shaq, what's going on? Karen's smirk faded. Shaq spoke casually, his voice steady but firm. I'm at La Maison, just trying to enjoy a meal. But we got a problem here. The voice on the other end grew sharp. What kind of problem? Shaq glanced down at Karen, his eyes locking onto hers. The kind that needs handling. The voice paused. Then came a slow exhale. Say no more. The call ended. Karen's face paled slightly. Who was that? She demanded, her voice betraying a hint of nervousness. Shaq simply picked up his fork and returned to his seat. You'll see. A heavy silence stretched between them, broken only by the murmurs of the other diners, who were now fully invested in what was about to happen next. And then, the restaurant doors swung open. Two men in dark suits stepped inside, their polished shoes clicking against the floor as they surveyed the room. Their expressions were unreadable, but their presence alone sent a chill down the spines of everyone watching. Karen stiffened, her confidence flickering. Who the hell are they? Shaq casually popped a piece of steak into his mouth, chewing slowly before answering. Reinforcements. Karen clutched her glass, her fingers turning white. For the first time that night, she realized. She wasn't in control anymore. The weight of the moment settled over the restaurant like a thick fog, tension gripping every soul in the room. The two men in dark suits strode forward with purpose, their polished shoes tapping against the marble floor, cutting through the silence like a knife. They weren't just any men. These were people with power, the kind of power that didn't need to be flaunted. Karen, still perched in her seat, felt her breath hitch as she got a good look at them. One was tall and broad-shouldered, his sharp, assessing eyes scanning the room with the kind of precision that meant he missed nothing. The other, slightly older, adjusted his cufflinks as he walked, exuding a quiet authority that commanded immediate respect. The restaurant manager practically tripped over himself trying to greet them. Sir, he stammered, eyes flicking nervously to Karen, then to Shaq. I wasn't expecting you tonight. The taller man, the one leading the charge, didn't waste time on pleasantries. His voice was calm but firm. What's going on here? Karen let out a breathy, forced laugh and lifted her chin, trying to salvage her rapidly crumbling confidence. Oh, just a tiny misunderstanding. These people, she gestured vaguely, are blowing things way out of proportion. The older man, now standing directly in front of her, cocked his head slightly. His sharp gaze flickered to the restaurant manager, who swallowed hard before speaking. Sir, she assaulted an employee, he said quickly, glancing at Daniel, the waiter still clutching his stinging cheek. And she, caused a scene. Karen's stomach twisted into a knot. The taller man's gaze darkened. Assaulted? His tone held a dangerous edge. Shaq, watching it all unfold, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, amusement flickering in his eyes. But when he spoke, his voice was steady, calculated. Tell him exactly what you said about people like me. The color drained from Karen's face so fast it was almost impressive. She fumbled, her lips parting, searching for an excuse. But the murmuring of the surrounding customers grew louder. Someone whispered, "Play the video." Another voice added, "She said it loud and clear." The taller man, now identified by murmuring patrons as Elliot Grayson, the CEO of the entire restaurant chain, turned his full attention to Karen. His face was unreadable, but there was a storm brewing in his expression. "We need to talk. Now." Karen swallowed hard, gripping the edge of the table. For the first time, the weight of her actions was sinking in, and there was nowhere left to run. Karen let out a shaky laugh, the forced confidence in her voice barely concealing the fear creeping into her eyes. "Oh, come on, Elliot," she said, flashing an uneasy smile. "This is all just a misunderstanding." She gestured dismissively toward Daniel, the waiter she had slapped, as if swatting away an insignificant detail. "He was being unprofessional. I was just—" A voice from the crowd cut her off. "Want to see the video?" The restaurant went silent. Karen's breath hitched. Slowly, customers began raising their phones, screens glowing as they played back the exact moment she had struck Daniel across the face. In one, her voice rang out clear as day. "They let those kinds of people in here now?" In another, the sickening smack of the slap echoed through the speakers. Karen's face paled as she turned to Elliot, the CEO, desperately hoping he wouldn't take this seriously. Those can be edited, you know. People manipulate videos all the time these days." Her voice pitched higher, almost pleading. Elliot remained silent, his sharp blue eyes locked onto her. He had cleaned up Karen's messes before. Too many times. She was the kind of customer the elite protected, the kind who threw money around to make problems disappear. But not this time. His jaw tightened. "Karen," she stiffened, "I'm done cleaning up your messes." The weight of his words hit her like a punch to the gut. The entire restaurant was watching. Customers who had once smiled politely at her now looked at her with contempt. The manager, who had been too afraid to intervene earlier, let out a breath of relief. Even the waitstaff, who had always served her with forced politeness, exchanged knowing glances. She had lost them all. Karen's hands trembled as she reached out toward Elliot. "Please, let's talk about this privately. I'll donate to the restaurant. A huge donation. We can make this go away." Elliot didn't budge. His voice was firm, final. "You're banned from all our restaurants, forever." Gasps rippled through the crowd as Karen stumbled back, shaking her head in disbelief. "You can't do this to me," she shrieked. But the truth was sinking in. Her privilege had finally run out. Karen gripped the steering wheel of her luxury SUV with white-knuckled hands, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. The glow of her phone screen illuminated her face in the dim parking lot as she scrolled through the endless flood of notifications. Her name was everywhere. A viral video, a trending hashtag, a wave of outrage that stretched far beyond the walls of the restaurant. Karen Whitmore exposed. Justice for Daniel. Run, Shaq did it again. She clicked on one of the countless reposts of the video. There she was, her face twisted in rage, her palm striking Daniel with a loud smack, her voice dripping with entitlement. "They let those kinds of people in here now?" The caption beneath it read, "This is what privilege looks like." Karen gasped as she scrolled further. Someone had posted her home address. Others were digging into her past, exposing her history of complaints against employees, tantrums at luxury boutiques, and even a lawsuit filed by a former housekeeper. She felt sick. Her phone buzzed with a call. Her boss. With trembling fingers, she answered. Hello? Karen." His tone was ice cold. "Have you seen what's happening?" "I can explain," she blurted, gripping the phone tighter. "The video doesn't tell the whole story. The only story that matters is the one playing on every news station right now," he cut in. "This company has a reputation to uphold. We cannot be associated with—" "I've been loyal to this company for 10 years, Karen screeched. "You can't fire me over a waiter." A tense silence. Then the final blow. "You're fired, Karen, effective immediately." The call disconnected. Karen's heart pounded. This couldn't be real. This was just the internet overreacting. It would all blow over, right? A notification popped up. An email from her homeowners association. She clicked it with shaking hands. Dear Mrs. Whitmore, due to the recent allegations and viral footage, the HOA board has decided to conduct an official review of multiple harassment complaints filed against you by neighbors. Karen's blood ran cold. Her own neighborhood was turning against her. She slammed her fists against the steering wheel. No, this can't be happening. Karen's scream echoed through the empty parking lot, but nothing could drown out the sound of her world crashing down. Karen barely had time to process the chaos already unfolding when another storm hit, one she never saw coming. Her phone vibrated aggressively on the marble countertop of her kitchen. More notifications, more outrage, but one stood out, a headline. Exposed! Karen Whitmore's hidden past finally comes to light. Karen's breath hitched as she clicked the link. The article wasn't from a gossip site. It was from a major news outlet. And worse, it wasn't just about this incident. It was about something far worse, an old scandal, one she thought was buried. Years ago, Karen had been involved in a high-profile fraud case, embezzlement disguised as charity fundraising. Thousands of dollars gone without a trace. She should have been arrested, but thanks to her wealthy connections, the case had disappeared before it could reach trial. Or so she thought. Now the internet had found it. A video clip surfaced, a local news report from years ago, where an investigator called out Karen by name, urging authorities to dig deeper. Karen's eyes widened. She scrolled through the comments. Wait, she stole from a charity. Why is she not in jail yet? Shaq needs to see this. And then, the worst notification of all, a new tweet from Shaquille O'Neal himself. Guess it's time to make another call. Stay tuned. Karen felt the ground beneath her shift. Her stomach twisted in knots. He wasn't just taking her down for the restaurant scandal. He was about to finish her. The room spun. She stumbled toward her front door, gripping the frame to steady herself. She needed to think, to plan, to ding-dong. The sound cut through her thoughts like a knife. Karen turned slowly toward the door. Outside, the flashing red light of a camera glowed through the glass. A news crew. The camera zoomed in as Karen's trembling hand reached for the doorknob. This time, there was no escaping the truth. Karen pressed her back against the heavy wooden door, her breath uneven as the commotion outside grew louder. The voices of reporters cut through the air, their words sharp and relentless. Through the frosted glass panel, she could see the glare of flashing cameras illuminating her once pristine front porch. Mrs. Whitmore, do you have a statement regarding the fraud allegations? A voice called out. How long have you been covering up these crimes? Another reporter demanded. She winced, pressing her palms to her temples. Did your husband know about the missing charity funds? That last question sent a sharp pang through her chest. Her husband, Greg. Karen turned abruptly, hurrying down the hallway, her expensive heels clicking against the marble floor. Her pulse quickened as she reached the master bedroom, flinging open the door. The moment she stepped inside, a cold wave of dread settled over her. The closet doors stood ajar, but something was wrong. The usually neat rows of tailored suits were missing, replaced by empty hangers that swayed slightly, as if disturbed just moments ago. The top dresser drawers gaped open, their contents hastily emptied. Her breath hitched. With shaky hands, she scanned the room, her gaze landing on the nightstand. A single folded note rested on its surface. Slowly, she reached for it, fingers trembling as she unfolded the crisp paper. Karen, I warned you. I can't be part of this. You've burned every bridge, and now you're on your own. Don't call me. Her vision blurred. The man she had counted on, the man who had stood by her for years, had walked away. A sharp knock echoed through the house, making her flinch. She turned her head toward the door, her breath catching in her throat. The reporters were still outside, their muffled voices persistent, but this knock was different. It was firm, measured, carrying the weight of authority. With hesitant steps, she made her way back to the living room, her heart pounding in her chest. Through the peephole, she saw a man in a sharp gray suit standing at her doorstep. He wasn't holding a microphone or a camera. Instead, he carried a thick folder tucked under his arm. Karen swallowed hard. This wasn't a reporter. This wasn't the police. This was a lawyer. The knock came again, louder this time. Mrs. Whitmore, the man said in a calm, professional tone, we need to talk. You've just been served. Her stomach twisted into knots. Her hands trembled as she gripped the doorknob, paralyzed by the weight of reality crashing down on her. This wasn't just public humiliation anymore. This was the beginning of her downfall. Karen's world had just collapsed, and the worst was yet to come. Karen sat stiffly in the courtroom, her manicured nails digging into the wooden table as the murmurs of the crowd echoed around her. The air felt suffocating, the weight of countless eyes pressing against her from every angle. She had been in uncomfortable situations before, but nothing like this. Across the room, Daniel sat beside his lawyer, his expression calm but resolute. He wasn't the timid waiter she had humiliated that night. He was a man seeking justice. And standing beside him, like an unshakable force, was Big Shaq. His massive frame made the wooden bench look small, but it wasn't just his size that filled the room. It was his presence. Karen's throat felt dry as the judge adjusted his glasses and shuffled a stack of papers. His expression was unreadable, but the sternness in his eyes sent a chill through her spine. "Mrs. Whitmore," the judge began, his voice steady, controlled, but laced with authority. "You are being sued for assault and defamation. We have multiple eyewitness accounts, video evidence, and now an official complaint filed against you." Karen scoffed, flipping her blonde hair over her shoulder. "This is ridiculous," she muttered under her breath. The judge's eyes snapped up. "You'll speak when spoken to, Mrs. Whitmore." Her face burned as a few quiet chuckles rippled through the audience. She shot a glare toward Daniel, but he didn't even flinch. Daniel's lawyer rose from his seat, buttoning his suit jacket. "Your Honor, my client was publicly humiliated, physically assaulted, and slandered in a restaurant filled with witnesses. Mrs. Whitmore not only attacked him, but attempted to use her privilege and status to justify her actions. This was a blatant abuse of power, and my client deserves justice." Karen clenched her fists. "I barely touched him," she snapped. "People are making a big deal out of nothing." The judge leaned forward, his jaw tightening. "A video recording of you slapping Mr. Daniels is currently sitting in my evidence file, Mrs. Whitmore. Would you like to see it again?" Karen's mouth snapped shut. The lawyer continued. "Given the evidence, we are seeking the maximum penalty for both emotional and physical damages." He glanced at Daniel before turning back to the judge. "Additionally, my client has lost his job due to the negative attention brought upon him after this incident. His reputation was tarnished simply because he was doing his job." Karen felt a pang of panic twist in her gut. The judge exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple. "Mrs. Whitmore, you have left this court with very little doubt as to your guilt. Given the circumstances, I am seriously considering—" The tension in the room thickened as the judge's next words cut through the air like a blade. "You could be facing jail time, Karen." The color drained from Karen's face. This was no longer just a lawsuit. This was the fight for her freedom. Karen sat in the bright studio lights, dabbing her tear-streaked face with a tissue as the cameras rolled. Her perfectly styled blonde hair was slightly disheveled, and the foundation on her face was barely holding up against the crocodile tears streaming down her cheeks. The talk show host, a sharp-eyed woman in a navy blue suit, leaned forward, her expression unreadable. "I just don't understand why people are being so cruel to me," Karen sniffled, her voice cracking. "I was having a bad day. I overreacted. But am I really such a terrible person that I deserve all this?" The audience was silent. No applause, no sympathy. The host raised an eyebrow. "Karen, with all due respect, this wasn't just an overreaction. You physically assaulted a waiter. You belittled an entire restaurant. And now videos are surfacing of you behaving like this in the past." Karen shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "People are twisting the story. They're making me look like a monster." A deep male voice from the audience cut through the tension. "Nah, you've been like this for years." Gas rippled through the crowd. The camera panned to a man standing in the back row, an ex-employee from Karen's former company. "I worked under you," he continued. "You treated your staff like garbage. You humiliated people for fun. And now you want pity?" Karen's jaw tightened. "That's not true. I was a respected businesswoman." Another voice, this time a woman. "You got fired for racial discrimination." Karen's hands balled into fists. "That was never proven." The host looked down at her notes, shaking her head. "Actually, court documents show multiple complaints filed against you over the years." The audience murmured in disgust. As if things couldn't get worse, Karen's phone buzzed in her lap. She peeked at the screen, her breath catching. Account frozen. Insufficient funds. Her bank had locked her out. She swallowed hard. Her stocks had plummeted. Her business partners had dropped her. Her real estate investments were crumbling. She was drowning in debt. The host folded her hands. Karen, do you feel any genuine remorse for what you've done? Karen opened her mouth, then hesitated. If she admitted guilt, it was over. If she denied it, she would be hated even more. Before she could speak, a producer rushed onto the stage and whispered something in the host's ear. The host's eyes widened. She turned back to the camera, lips curling into a smirk. Ladies and gentlemen, you're going to want to stay tuned, because Big Shaq just made a move that will leave Karen absolutely speechless. Karen gripped the steering wheel of her old, beaten-down sedan, her knuckles white from the pressure. The luxury car she once flaunted was gone, repossessed along with everything else. She sat parked across the street from what used to be her grand estate, her eyes wide with disbelief. A large banner now hung over the gates. Whitmore Safe Haven, a shelter for victims of harassment. Her throat tightened as she watched workers carry in supplies. Volunteers bustled around, setting up beds, organizing food donations, and welcoming women and children who had nowhere else to go. The house that once symbolized her wealth and power was now filled with laughter, warmth, and hope, none of which belonged to her anymore. And then, the final blow. A black SUV pulled up, and out stepped the man who had unknowingly set her downfall into motion. Big Shaq. He was dressed casually, his signature confidence unwavering. He walked through the front gates like he owned the place, because now he did. Karen's breath caught in her throat. Shaq had bought her house. She scrambled to open her car door, stumbling onto the pavement. This can't be happening, she sputtered, her voice cracking. Shaq turned at the sound of her voice. For a moment, he just looked at her, as if he barely recognized the broken woman standing before him. Then, with an easy, unbothered stride, he walked toward her. Karen swallowed hard as his towering frame cast a shadow over her. You did this? She whispered, her voice trembling. Shaq folded his arms. Nah, he said coolly. You did this. Karen shook her head, her desperation spilling out. Please, Shaq, I lost everything. My job, my money, my friends. Shaq didn't flinch. And that waiter you slapped? He lost his dignity in front of a whole restaurant. Karen's lips parted, but no words came out. Shaq exhaled, shaking his head. See, Karen, power ain't about stepping on people. It's about lifting them up. Karen looked past him, her vision blurring as she saw the people inside her home. People she would have never let inside before. People she used to mock. Shaq adjusted his jacket and turned to walk away. But just before he did, he glanced at her one last time. His voice was calm, almost amused. Karma's real, huh? And with that, he stepped through the gates, leaving Karen standing alone, homeless, humiliated, and completely powerless. Karen had vanished from the public eye, but the world hadn't forgotten her. Her name had become a lesson, a warning, a symbol of what happens when entitlement meets accountability. Meanwhile, Shaq had turned the entire situation into something far greater than revenge. The restaurant where it all started now had a new policy. Zero tolerance for workplace harassment. Employees were given better protection, and customers who disrespected workers were immediately banned. No second chances. And at the center of it all, Daniel. The once humiliated waiter now stood tall as the restaurant's new manager. With Shaq's support, Daniel had not only won his lawsuit against Karen, but had also been given the chance to lead. During the grand reopening event, reporters filled the space, eager for a statement. Shaq, towering over the crowd, stepped forward, his deep voice commanding attention. This was never about me, he said, looking directly into the cameras. It was about respect, and respect isn't a privilege. It's a choice. The internet erupted. The video went viral instantly, spreading across social media like wildfire. People around the world debated, discussed, and learned. Karen Whitmore wasn't just a name anymore. She was a cautionary tale. And Shaq, he had just turned justice into a movement.